Got the boat sink is right here in Cherry Hill, y'all.
By the late 19th century, Brooklyn had changed dramatically. What began in 1853 as a planned community in northern Anne Arundel County had grown through transportation, trade, and its close connection to Baltimore. The bridge across the Middle Branch connected Brooklyn with the city. Workers crossed the river searching for employment. Farmers and merchants carried goods toward Baltimore's markets. Families traveled between Anne Arundel County and the growing city to the north. Then, in 1878, Baltimore purchased the privately owned Light Street Bridge. The city removed the tolls and rebuilt the crossing. Stretching nearly a mile across the water, the bridge rested on wooden pilings and included a movable draw that allowed boats to pass. Removing the toll made travel easier. It also helped increase business, movement, and population on both sides of the river. But one important fact had not changed. Brooklyn was still not part of Baltimore City. It remained in Anne Arundel County. Even when Baltimore expanded its boundaries in 1888, the new city line did not cross the Middle Branch to include Brooklyn. That annexation added territory mainly north and west of the city. Yet Brooklyn became more connected to Baltimore with each passing year. Railroad tracks reached through the area. Businesses invested in land near the waterfront. Factories, railroad facilities, and industrial properties began transforming the surrounding landscape. Brooklyn was still legally part of Anne Arundel County, but economically it was becoming part of Baltimore's growing industrial world. And that is where the next chapter begins. Welcome back to History Through My Lens. I'm Kenny Captures. On this channel, we look beyond the streets we see today and uncover the history that still lives beneath them. By the late 1800s, Baltimore was booming. Factories multiplied, railroads expanded, and the harbor grew busier every year. Baltimore needed more room for houses, more room for factories, more room for railroad yards, warehouses, and transportation routes. City leaders and business investors began looking beyond Baltimore's existing borders, and to the south stood Brooklyn. Brooklyn offered access to the Middle Branch and the Patapsco River. It also provided transportation routes leading deeper into Anne Arundel County, along with open land that could support future growth. But Brooklyn was still outside Baltimore City. Politically, it belonged to Anne Arundel County. Economically, however, it was becoming increasingly tied to Baltimore. Baltimore's expansion of 1888 did not include Brooklyn. The community remained outside the city's boundaries for another 30 years. During those years, railroads, streetcars, industries, workers, and new development transformed Brooklyn and the land farther south. Then, in 1918, Maryland lawmakers approved an act that redrew Baltimore's boundaries and brought Brooklyn into the city. In this episode, we will explore how Brooklyn developed before annexation, how new industrial communities emerged farther south, and how the Annexation Act of 1918 changed the future of South Baltimore. This is History Through My Lens. Part 1. Connected before annexation. Brooklyn's connection to Baltimore did not begin when the city boundary changed. It had already existed for decades. The bridge across the Middle Branch provided an important route between Baltimore and northern Anne Arundel County. Workers traveled north toward jobs in the city. Farmers and merchants carried products toward Baltimore's markets. Families crossed the river for shopping, employment, business, and everyday needs. Then, in 1878, Baltimore purchased and rebuilt the Light Street Bridge. The city removed the tolls that travelers had previously been required to pay. Traffic increased, business increased, and land on the Anne Arundel County side of the river became more attractive to investors. The bridge did more than carry people across the water. It opened Brooklyn and the surrounding southern waterfront more fully to Baltimore's expanding economy. Brooklyn now stood between two worlds. It remained under Anne Arundel County government, but much of its economic life pointed north toward Baltimore. Part 2. The railroad changes Brooklyn. Before Brooklyn became part of Baltimore City, another powerful force was already transforming the community. The railroad. Baltimore business leaders founded the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1827. Their goal was to connect the city with markets farther west and strengthen Baltimore's position against competing East Coast ports. Construction began the following year. Over the decades that followed, The B&O developed into one of the most important railroad systems in the country. By the early 1880s, railroad and business investors were increasing their activity around Brooklyn and the southern waterfront. In 1882, the South Baltimore Harbor, an improving company, purchased land in Brooklyn that had belonged to the earlier Patapsco Company. At the time, Brooklyn had a population of roughly 500 people. During the same period, the B&O constructed its Curtis Bay branch. Businessmen connected to the railroad and development company also established the South Baltimore Car Works to build railroad cars for the B&O. Tracks passed through the Brooklyn area and continued toward the waterfront at Curtis Bay. Freight could now move between inland railroad lines, industrial properties, warehouses, and ships along the Patapsco River. Coal, lumber, fertilizer, machinery, raw materials, and manufactured goods. All of these products could now travel through the region in greater quantities. Brooklyn's location near both rail and water made it increasingly valuable. The railroad brought more than trains, it brought investment, it brought employment, and it changed how the surrounding land would be used. Part 3. Land becomes industrial property. Before this period, much of the landscape surrounding Brooklyn included homes, small businesses, farms, wooded property, marshes, open land, and waterfront areas. Industrial growth began changing that landscape. Property near the railroad and river could support warehouses, factories, workshops, storage yards, railroad facilities, and shipping operations. Raw materials could arrive by train. Workers could process those materials near the waterfront, and finished products could leave by railroad or ship. The South Baltimore Car Works produced railroad cars near the growing rail corridor. Other businesses were attracted by the same transportation advantages. Brooklyn had not moved inside Baltimore's legal boundary, but Baltimore money and industry were already moving south. The village was being pulled closer to the city through transportation, investment, land development, and employment. Part 4. The railroad brought opportunity. Industrial growth created new forms of employment. Railroad workers maintained tracks, locomotives, freight cars, and equipment. Carpenters constructed buildings and railroad cars. Machinists repaired industrial machinery. Blacksmiths shaped and repaired tools and metal parts. Dock workers loaded and unloaded cargo. Laborers moved coal, lumber, fertilizer, machinery, and other heavy materials. The work was exhausting, and it could be dangerous. Moving trains, exposed machinery, heavy cargo, smoke, dust, and long working hours. All of these were part of industrial life. Workers did not have the safety protections people expect today. But these jobs also provided income for families. As employment increased, more people were drawn toward Brooklyn and the developing southern waterfront. The neighborhood's growth was not shaped only by railroad executives, investors, or factory owners. It was built through the labor of ordinary people. People who laid tracks, repaired equipment, carried freight, built homes, opened businesses, and raised families there. Part 5. Streetcars moved the people. The railroad moved freight. Streetcars moved people. Electric streetcar service reached Brooklyn in 1892. This made travel between Brooklyn and Baltimore faster and more dependable. Residents no longer had to rely only on walking, horses, wagons, or privately arranged transportation. Workers could travel farther to reach employment. Families could reach Baltimore's stores and markets more easily. Businesses gained access to more customers, and land near streetcar routes became more attractive for housing and commercial development. The streetcar strengthened a connection that already existed. Brooklyn remained politically inside Anne Arundel County, but transportation was bringing it closer to Baltimore every day. Part 6. A working community grows. As transportation and employment expanded, Brooklyn continued growing. New houses appeared. Stores and small businesses served local families. Churches and schools became important parts of community life. Workers traveled between Brooklyn, Baltimore, and the developing industrial areas farther south. Some residents lived near their jobs. Others crossed the bridge or used streetcars to reach employment elsewhere. Black residents, immigrants, railroad employees, craftspeople, dock workers, factory workers, merchants, and domestic workers all contributed to the region's growth. Brooklyn was no longer simply a village beside Baltimore. It had become part of a wider network of workers, industries, transportation routes, Curtis businesses,
develops
and
farther
waterfront
south.
communities. But legally,
as industry
it still
expanded,
remained outside
development
the city
moved
line.
beyond Brooklyn.
Farther south was the body of water known as Curtis Bay. The geographic name existed before a developed industrial neighborhood stood there. During the years after Baltimore's 1888 expansion, railroad and industrial investment helped create a new community around the Curtis Bay waterfront. The B&O extended its rail connections south from Brooklyn toward the bay. Rail yards, industrial properties, shipping facilities, and worker housing developed around that transportation network. This distinction is important. Brooklyn already existed before Baltimore's 1888 expansion and remained outside the city afterward. Curtis Bay, as a developed industrial community, grew outside Baltimore during the years that followed. Both places remained in Anne Arundel County until Baltimore's 1918 expansion. The waterfront was already known as Curtis Bay. The industrial neighborhood developed later, and it developed outside Baltimore City. Part 8. Brooklyn, Curtis Bay, and the southern waterfront. Brooklyn and Curtis Bay developed during different periods, but transportation and industry tied them together. Brooklyn had been established decades earlier. Curtis Bay grew later as railroad and industrial investment moved farther south. A person could live in Brooklyn and work near Curtis Bay. Freight trains traveled through Brooklyn on their way toward the southern waterfront. Roads, streetcars, railroad tracks, bridges, and waterways connected the communities. Development also spread through nearby areas such as Fairfield. Together, these places became part of a growing industrial corridor along the Patapsco River. But they were not founded at the same time. They did not develop in exactly the same way. And before annexation, the territory remained under Anne Arundel County government. Part 9. Progress came with a price. Industrial development brought employment and investment, but it also brought serious consequences. Factories produced smoke and waste. Coal and industrial dust affected the surrounding air and land. Freight trains created noise, sparks, and heavy traffic. Workers faced dangerous machinery and physically demanding conditions. Homes stood increasingly close to tracks, factories, yards, and industrial facilities. Development also created a greater need for public infrastructure. Residents needed improved roads. They needed drainage and sanitation. They needed water and sewer systems capable of serving a growing population. And they needed police and fire protection suited to an increasingly urban and industrial community. Brooklyn and the developing southern waterfront were connected to Baltimore's economy, but Anne Arundel County remained responsible for governing the territory. That difference became increasingly important as the communities grew. Part 10. Why 1888 matters. Baltimore had expanded its boundaries several times during the 19th century. A major annexation took place in 1888. Territory north and west of Baltimore became part of the city. But the new boundary did not cross the Middle Branch to include Brooklyn. Brooklyn remained inside Anne Arundel County. Curtis Bay's industrial community then developed outside Baltimore during the decades that followed. This wording matters. Brooklyn remained outside Baltimore because it already existed before the 1888 annexation. Curtis Bay, as an industrial neighborhood, developed outside Baltimore after that annexation. By the early 20th century, both communities were closely tied to Baltimore's transportation and industrial economy, but neither was yet legally inside Baltimore City. Part 11. Why Baltimore wanted to expand again. By the early 20th century, Baltimore's official boundary no longer matched the full reach of its economy. Homes and businesses had spread beyond the city line. Railroads and streetcars crossed municipal boundaries. Industrial facilities operated along waterfront property in Anne Arundel County. People living outside Baltimore traveled into the city for work, trade, shopping, and transportation. Baltimore leaders argued that a larger city could better coordinate roads, sanitation, water, sewers, police protection, fire protection, housing, and future development. The city also wanted additional land for population and industrial growth. Brooklyn and the southern waterfront were strategically important because of their location near the Patapsco River, railroad routes, bridges, industries, and shipping facilities. But Baltimore could not simply move its boundaries south on its own. Changing the city's boundaries required action by the Maryland General Assembly. Part 12. How annexation happened. In 1918, the Maryland General Assembly passed Chapter 82, commonly known as the Annexation Act. The act extended Baltimore City's limits into portions of Baltimore County and Anne Arundel County. The legal boundary description ran from Baltimore's existing limits toward the intersection of the Annapolis, or Light Street, road and the road leading from Brooklyn to Pumphrey. From there, it continued toward Curtis Creek, Hawkins Point, and the waters surrounding the southern waterfront. This new boundary placed Brooklyn and the surrounding peninsula inside Baltimore City. Brooklyn residents did not simply hold an independent neighborhood vote and decide to join Baltimore. The decisive legal action came through state legislation. The Maryland General Assembly passed the act, and Governor Emerson C. Harrington approved it on March 29, 1918. The law stated that the described territory was added to Baltimore City. It also extended the city's charter, laws, and ordinances into the annexed territory. The clearest and most historically accurate way to explain it is this. In 1918, Maryland passed the Annexation Act, bringing Brooklyn and surrounding Anne Arundel County territory into Baltimore City. Some financial and administrative arrangements continued during the transition. But historically, Brooklyn became part of Baltimore through the Annexation Act of 1918. Part 13. What annexation changed? Annexation changed which government controlled Brooklyn. The neighborhood was no longer governed as part of Anne Arundel County. Baltimore City's charter, local laws, and ordinances were extended into the annexed territory. The city became responsible for incorporating Brooklyn into its municipal government and infrastructure systems. That included the gradual expansion and improvement of streets, sanitation, water, sewer service, police protection, fire protection, and other city services. But annexation did not transform Brooklyn overnight. Baltimore added an enormous amount of territory. The city expanded from roughly 30 square miles to approximately 92 square miles. Much of the newly annexed territory was still open or lightly developed. Some areas contained dense neighborhoods and industries. Others still included farms, marshland, wooded property, and undeveloped land. Building infrastructure across the enlarged city took years. For Brooklyn, annexation was not the end of its transformation. It marked the beginning of a new phase. Brooklyn's journey into Baltimore did not begin with the Annexation Act. It began decades earlier. The bridge connected Brooklyn to the city. The railroad connected it to Baltimore's harbor and markets farther inland. Streetcars carried residents between the village and Baltimore. Industries created employment and transformed the landscape. By the early 20th century, Brooklyn was already deeply connected to Baltimore's daily life. But legally, it remained inside Anne Arundel County. Baltimore's 1888 expansion did not include Brooklyn. During the years that followed, the industrial community of Curtis Bay developed farther south, also outside Baltimore's boundary. Then came the Annexation Act. In 1918, Maryland extended Baltimore City's boundaries into parts of Anne Arundel County and Baltimore County. Brooklyn, Curtis Bay, Fairfield, and the surrounding territory inside the new boundary became part of Baltimore City. For Brooklyn, the 1918 annexation ended more than 60 years as a community within Anne Arundel County. But annexation did not erase its identity. Workers continued building lives there. Families continued shaping its streets. Transportation and industry continued transforming the southern waterfront. And the consequences of that growth, both the opportunities and the environmental burdens, would influence the community for generations. In the next episode of History Through My Lens, we will travel farther south. We will explore how Curtis Bay and Fairfield developed, how industry changed the waterfront, and how the labor of local communities helped power Baltimore's growth. I'm Kenny Captures. Thank you for watching History Through My Lens, where we look beyond the streets we see today and uncover the history that still lives beneath them.
So this the Bill No Railroad. Y'all, they changed the name. This the new name, y'all. Oh, you see the museum closed. I'm here at 7 o'clock. It's 10 to 4. That's what the museum look like.